Hello, everybody again. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Jayati Ghosh. She brings with her a wealth of knowledge and insight into the central theme of our workshop, A Path to Inclusive Development, Unpacking Gender Inequalities in Economic Theory and Policies. Professor Ghosh's extensive work in economics, particularly on issues of development, global inequality, and gender, has profound impact on shaping academic and policy discourse. Her contributions have consistently illuminated the intersections of gender and economics, helping to foster more inclusive and equitable policy solutions. We are honored to have her with us today and look forward to her valuable insights on how we can challenge and rethink traditional economic frameworks in a better way. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jayati Ghosh.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So first of all, let me say how delighted I am to be invited to this conference and how really awful I feel that I missed the first 2 days because it's clearly been an amazing conference. It's wonderful to see so many old friends and young friends and colleagues and researchers whom I respect and admire. It's really, I really feel just seeing all of you actually makes me feel charged up. And after this morning's absolutely brilliant panel, so thoughtful, so insightful, I feel even more charged up. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. I have to confess that I was, especially after I had the panel, I had a whole bunch of prepared remarks, but I'm not going to use them because I figured, what can I say that you already don't know? You really know. I mean, come on, really. See, it's quite obvious that there's really nothing that I can provide that you don't already know. So I'm instead actually just going to be thinking aloud because we're among friends and about a dilemma which I think all of us face, but it's really been troubling me over the last few years in particular. And let me explain what this dilemma is. It was kind of hinted at, or actually it was also said in the last panel to some extent, which is that, now more than ever, we have fantastic research. We have really, I think, made a lot of important insights in feminist economics. We've got much more subtle and nuanced, innovative research. Younger scholars are doing great work. We have wonderful policy solutions. And some of it is because of the modeling that IPEC and people have done. Some of it is because of other sectoral strategies that people have looked at. At the international level, the national level, the meso level, the local level, we've got everything. We've got it all out there, okay? Why doesn't it seem to make much difference? Okay, so maybe I'm sounding like Valeria's daughter. I want to master. We are beginning to, maybe it's the thin end of the wedge, maybe we are nibbling at the edges, and at some point the whole, like the mice keep at it, and eventually the edifice crumbles. But we have to stop and ask ourselves, what do we do, first of all? I mean, is what we are doing enough, or is there something else we should be doing, or is there a different way we should be doing this to actually change things, to actually move things? And what exactly could we do? And this is not that I have any answers, let me be clear, okay? And this is me asking the questions and hoping that we can collectively brainstorm about this. So, there are different reasons we could advance for why it hasn't had, I'm not saying it's had no impact. Of course we know, and we've got some evidence of that, right? In particular countries and in where you get propitious conditions, we have had impact. And certainly at the international level, the discourse has changed, except in some international financial institutions and so on. Or maybe, let me put it differently, the discourse has changed, which doesn't necessarily mean that the strategies have changed, okay? But we are still very much, I won't say marginal, because now our voices are there and our faces are there and all that, but we are not impactful in the way in which we should be. So let's just try and think about why. So one obvious answer is that patriarchy is alive, kicking, fighting back, and so on. And no surprises, it is and will and continues to do so at all levels, including in bureaucracies, including in all levels of policy making, in the law making and the judiciary and so on and so forth. Patriarchy for sure. But maybe there is something in our own strategies. Maybe we need to rethink how we concentrate our time, efforts, and everything else. And I'm not necessarily talking about the research, because I do think in research we've got all kinds of exciting directions. And I think younger people are doing lots of new things which are really good. And I'm not talking now about the research. I'm talking about translating that research into policies that will actually be implemented, or at least attempted to be implemented, or that there will be sufficient movement to actually change things. And so maybe we've made a few, I won't say mistakes, I will say maybe we've allowed ourselves to be taken in some wrong directions in some cases, and also we've allowed ourselves to be used. Okay, let me be frank about it. And this is, as I said, I'm speaking among friends, and I think you will all understand what I mean. And I'm going to list a few of the things where I think these have happened, okay? One is in terms of when we got sidetracked in terms of the care economy and assigning monetary values to the work. And I mean, there are all kinds of reasons for doing it, just to bring policymakers' attention to it and so on and so forth. But it also makes us completely trapped in the whole GDP framework. Yeah. And so we are implicitly accepting that, you know, monetary value ultimately is what matters, and that only things that do get exchanged and the value at which they get exchanged is of social value. So there has been a problem with this, and it persists. Okay, I mean, this is a contradiction among feminist economists, all of us, and many of us are in two minds about it ourselves. But certainly among feminists, this whole issue of unpaid work and how to value it, and the ascribing of monetary value has been a major concern. And I do believe that that's a wrong concern. I'm going to come back to that, but let me put that out there as one of the things where maybe we got sidetracked. I do believe, in fact, that instead we should be pushing time use, which is so excellently done in this place that we are speaking right now. I'm looking at a bunch of people who have done great work on this. And Indira and others. I mean, you know, we should focus much more on that, but not necessarily ascribe monetary values to that. I want to note that, for example, in the UN right now, or maybe I come back to this one. But I come back to this. I think it's an important issue. One area where, frankly, I don't think if we got sidetracked, we got conned, is gender budgeting. And I'm sorry. I mean, look, I know that there are many people who are deeply devoted to gender budgeting. I know that when Diane and others proposed it, Diane Nelson and others proposed it, it was truly revolutionary and thinking in a different way and so on. But we know what's happening. We know that governments across the world are basically using this as a way of shoving various things into a particular column and saying, oh yeah, look, we're spending, I don't know, 26% of our budget on women and so on. Completely meaningless, crapulous, okay, whatever, fair washing, if you like. But we've been conned into it, and we keep accepting it. I mean, in my own country, India, one of the worst anti-women governments we have had in my living memory has just announced that it has spent more through its gender budget on women than any previous government in Indian history. Yeah? And you can do that. You can simply put, you know, any second thing you shove in there and say, yeah, see, it's affecting all these women and so on. So really, I think we have to now call it out and say, sorry, we can't say, let's improve it, let's try and make the indicator better and so on, because they will find other ways of basically just manipulating it, making it meaningless. So let's move on. Let's not trap ourselves in the gender budgeting perspective, because it's not really about fiscal policy, as we heard, right? Fiscal policy is a bigger, broader issue, covering, of course, resource raising generally, taxation, other measures, etc., but also the kind of spending which don't necessarily get, shall we say, neatly pigeonholed into gender criteria, but have massive impacts, gender differentiated impacts. So I think we should say we are going to look at public finance, and we're not going to take a very obvious gender budgeting kind of framework to do this. I think another thing we did was we had an inadequate recognition of specific financial policies. Now, I forgot that I wanted to begin. I know Rania and people have done a lot of work on financial crises and women. I mean, many people in this room have looked at the impact of financial crises and all of that, the gender differentiated impact. But it doesn't have to be a crisis. Financial strategies have massive gender impacts. How you regulate capital flows has massive gender impacts. What you do in terms of monetary policy, not just the interest rate, but the kinds of liquidity you create and how they actually manifest among different sections has massive gender impacts. And again, we kind of left it to the macho guys to handle. We haven't said, no, you cannot do this because it has all of these other impacts. And I think even in terms of debt, the IMF now has a strategy for what they call market access economies. When they're trying to look at debt rescheduling or the debt sustainability analysis, they look at the overall debt to GDP rather than just the external sovereign debt, which is really what the problem is for most countries, right? And in that, they now say you have to reduce the total debt, which means you have to also restructure the domestic debt. You don't just restructure the foreign debt, you restructure the domestic debt. That, in countries where they have been able to implement it, there's been pushback in Ghana and Zambia, but in Sri Lanka, they were able to implement it. Also because it has, in fact, what is today an illegitimate government, but nonetheless, they were able to implement it. And who is actually being affected? It's the pension funds. Who are the major players in the pension funds? It's actually poor women workers in the plantations, in the garments industries, where it is a social security payment that they make. And we are now going to see the value of those pension falls fall by 1/3. Okay? For women who are already devastated by the impact of the crisis, the high electricity price, when we look at what we typically talk about is fiscal austerity. And yes, you can identify the implications of fiscal austerity and they're very clear. And now we know all those mechanisms. We've got all that taped. Not that we're able to do anything about it, but we know, right? But we haven't done enough about all these other financial measures. When governments tighten monetary policy, there are many ways in which this occurs. It's, yes, a rise in interest rates, but it's also affecting different kinds of liquidity. And typically, microcredit gets affected. Typically, the kinds of relatively low collateral kinds of credit get affected. And in many cases, the small and micro enterprises that women are largely associated with simply don't get the credit. Forget about higher rates, you simply are excluded from those markets. We need to be doing that kind of work as well and making sure that the macro policy actually has to address that dimension. Time poverty, which I think is such an important concept and which, again, people in this room have done so much to talk about, not just because of the care economy and unpaid work, but in general. We recognize it and we talk about it, but I think there's one aspect of it that we haven't adequately dwelt on, which is the impact on income poverty. The fact that time poverty translates not just into a terrible life for the person who is time poor, but also translates into income poverty in terms of the goods and services provided in unpaid fashion in that household. Because if you are a woman who is forced, I can cite you examples from India, they're innumerable, but I'm sure all of you know them. A woman who is forced to leave very early in the morning to commute to some work at a relatively low wage and commute back, yet has to do the unpaid household work of cooking, cleaning, etc., not looking after the child because they're not able to, but all the other stuff, the quality of those goods and services will be worse. I mean, it's unavoidable, right? You're doing it when you're exhausted, you're doing it with inadequate time. And in fact, therefore, although you claim that this is the value of these unpaid goods and services, in fact, they are not of the same quality. There is an association of time poverty with greater income poverty, which is not captured in multidimensional poverty measures. And we have to make sure that multidimensional poverty captures time poverty and what it means for the overall living conditions of poor households as well. But related to that, there is how should I put it? We get, I won't say sidetracked, but we get fobbed off with what I would call micro interventions. Yeah, it's a very typical and beloved policy device, not just of governments. Governments do it all the time, but also, let's face it, international organizations. And you can't blame them. I mean, look, I am very involved with and close to a bunch of international organizations, and I have been working with many of you for a long time. But what tends to, you're looking for something successful, you're looking for some change. And so what you do, you say, okay, let's do something here. Maybe create a livelihood package for a group of people here, or maybe improve some other thing, some small thing somewhere else. And of course, now, today, in the world we're in, the preferred way of doing a micro intervention is to first do an RCT, a randomized control trial. Yeah. And I won't even get started on RCTs, but let me just give you the bottom line. I don't like them. Okay. I don't like them for many reasons. There are ethical problems, there are methodological problems, but there is a fundamental conceptual problem. The idea that you can do a dipstick into one situation and say that that dipstick result is a gold standard, I quote, that will allow you to do the same intervention in other social contexts, cultural contexts, historical contexts, or even town contexts. The same thing may not work in the same place among the same people in the next year. Because it is society after all, and there are dynamics to these things. So, yeah. So the other problem with the RCTs, quite apart from all these other issues, is that they're very expensive. And there is one study that's done that is actually quite illuminating, that particular types of foreign aid increasingly, because you cannot do foreign aid anymore without RCTs. And typically the RCT cost accounts for half of the aid. And yeah, and of course these RCTs are all done by these researchers based in the global north. I'm not sure they are global northerners, but they are based in the global north. And they're all done on poor people in the developing world. I mean, try doing an RCT in Brooklyn, for example. It's not going to work, right? They won't let you because it's a violation of human rights. But anyway, okay. We also tend to get, I won't say fobbed off, but we are forced to accept talk rather than implementation or delivery. And I mean, I think all of us are familiar with this, right? We have wonderful statements coming out from our governments, coming out from international organizations. I mean, they say everything we want them to say. In fact, half the time we're involved in writing it. We're killing ourselves doing unpaid work in writing that thing, right? So yes, they say all the right things, but it doesn't translate into an actual policy or strategy. And we allow ourselves to do that. In other words, we move on to the next one. We're preparing the next statement, even before finishing the fight on getting that first statement done, if you see what I mean, in terms of doing rather than just writing. And that's part of the broader siloed approach. Now, we thought we were going to do gender mainstreaming, and to some extent, yeah, we are gender mainstream because we have mainstreamed gender into all of our other analysis, our micro, etc., international trade. We have mainstreamed gender into that. Have those policies mainstreamed gender? No. Okay, we're still a silo there. And this, I have to say, also, I see all in the international organizations. I mean, I deal with a lot of them, and I deal with the gender desks of these, and I deal with sometimes what I call the whatever desk you want to name it. I'm not going to name names, you all know what I'm talking about. Yeah? And when you're dealing with the other desks, when you're dealing with the other bits of that organization, it's as if all the stuff that was said in the other room, it's not there. Okay, and then if you bring it up, they say, yes, and. But it does not inform that discussion. Yeah? It's not really permeated. Now, okay, patriarchy, power, we know all the reasons, but I'm just saying that we have allowed ourselves to get into this trap in a way. We haven't made enough of a noise that they really have no choice, but to make sure that they do it from the very beginning. Okay? And this is related also to something that was raised in the previous panel, right? About, I think, Mary, Raquel, all of you raised it actually. That, there's no auditing or accountability of all the promises that are made. ILO conventions, for example, or all of the promises made in various documents that are signed on by even countries when they're negotiating with the World Bank or the IMF, they sign on to documents. There's no auditing of that part. The only things they actually audit is the aggregate spending and the deficit and all of those macro indicators. They don't audit the genuine social promises that were made, and I think that's a problem. I think also the issue of the complexity of some policies, maybe we have to be more careful about. Formalization. It's good, right? What's not to like? I mean, everybody would prefer a formal job and so on. And yet we know that the formalization policies implemented in far too many countries have been extremely gender insensitive and actually worsened the conditions, especially for women micro-entrepreneurs, women small enterprises, even women working in the informal sector. In India, we brought a law for maternity leave or equivalent payments for all women workers. And bam, we had 95% women in India are informal workers, the ones who are recognized as employed. Bam, you got a reduction in those workers. Why? Because they say, well, why should we pay maternity leave? So labor surplus economy, we're not going to pay it, and so on. Final point about getting sidetracked is that, so I was in Rio recently, just talking to Lisa about this. And, it's been an amazing process in Brazil, the whole pre-G20 work. And what a contrast to India. India was the president last year. And oh my God, the government in India did not allow any civil society discussion. In fact, the T20 forum, when we tried to have a meeting, we were shut down. The meeting venue, the police came and prevented us from entering. So they really didn't want any civil society discussion. They just wanted, supposedly cleaned up capital city where you could drive all the delegates through without any. Brazil, by contrast, was fantastic, right? I mean, I don't know how many T20 teams you had, 37. That's some incredible number. There was a T everything. Yeah, T women, T workers, T favelas, T, I mean, many Ts. And they were all active, they all worked, all unpaid labor. Yeah, everybody is out there thinking of what can be done, what should be done, how to get it, really wonderful, amazing, very inspiring, very productive work. How much of it is likely to get into the G20 document? Zero. Right? Let's be clear. And by the way, even people who are in the presidency office negotiating say it's not going to get in there. The only one that gets in there is B20, business 20. So we do all this, and then this happens, and then that's it. So what do we do? So now, okay, these are all the problems or concerns. Let me put it this way. These are my concerns. I suspect they're also your concerns inside, how do we deal with this? How do we actually combat this tendency that is going on in this pretty severe way? So I would argue that, first of all, when we do all this work, because we think it might have an impact, we shouldn't let it go to waste. And this is something I think, broadly, we as the global left have to learn from the right, okay? Which is that we have to have a long-term vision. I mean, I can tell you the right wing has a really long-term vision. I mean, think of the Mo Pelerin Society, right? They started, 60 years ago? And more, okay? And get at it. In India, you think of the RSS, it's the stormtroopers of the Modi government, this fascist group, which actually is the only place where Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf, is actually a basic text for anyone who joins, okay? They have been at it again for half a century, persistent through periods when they were outlawed, through periods when they were, actively the state was against them. They have just been out there. They don't give up. By contrast, I think too many of us, and I include myself, we get very disheartened at failures or inability to have an impact. And we say, oh, okay, no, forget it. Or we move on to the next thing, hoping that that will have an impact. We don't keep at it. So I think our first message has got to be persistence. Despite the failure, we just persist, and make so much noise that it, and eventually, when the time is right, something actually does get heard and get done. And it doesn't have to be globally, it can be in parts of the world, but something somewhere will persist, but you have to keep that plane going, no matter how small, I think is the first thing. But the second is, really we have to move away from the whole GDP-oriented thing. And, we keep saying it, but we are not actively mobilizing against it. And what do I mean by actively mobilizing? We keep falling into this trap ourselves, right? We're always saying GDP for work, at least I am. I mean, we're all using GDP, investment rates, which are all GDP. We're always using GDP. And okay, maybe for some macro and global indicators, it makes sense. Not in purchasing power parity terms, but in the in nominal market exchange rates. But for a whole bunch of other things, it is really not a good indicator, right? We know that it sucks. And I don't have to tell this group why it sucks. You all know better than me, right? It includes a lot of stuff that shouldn't really be included as anything indicating human prosperity. And it excludes a lot of things that should be included, okay? But trying to include the things that have been excluded is not the solution, because the idea sucks. That marketed values are the indicator that matter. So I think we should be actively mobilizing for other indicators, not necessarily saying replace GDP, because we know that's not going to happen immediately, but add the others and then keep mentioning the others so that people know. And here I want to bring back this, I mentioned that in the UN right now, there is a discussion going on, which I have to confess, I was deeply disappointed, did not get more traction. So I was involved in an economic and social affairs board of the UN, which suggested some, I think it wasn't called alternatives, it was called additions to GDP or something. But here are some indicators that we said have to be monitored. That is to say, the UN statistical system should make it incumbent on all countries to report this data with as much frequency as possible, annual or quarterly or whatever. So the first one was what I've called the labor market indicator, okay? And this is the proportion of employed people in working age population multiplied by the median wage rate. Note, not the average wage rate, not the mean, but the median wage rate, okay? Now, this is a useful indicator because the proportion of those who are gainfully employed is also a kind of, it captures, for example, a lot of women who are not gainfully employed and so on and so forth. And the median wage rate, and if you do that gender differentiated, all the better. But even that aggregate number. So we did a couple of experiments in terms of how that would change how you look at the trajectory of different countries. In the United States, for example, the GDP per capita goes up, the labor market indicator is flat. In India, the GDP per capita, were a big growth success story, remember, is shooting up. The labor market indicator is declining. Okay? It's not the same for everything. In Thailand, in fact, the labor market indicator is doing better than the GDP. Okay? But nonetheless, it is a useful indicator. Okay? The second important indicator we mentioned was, in fact, time use. That is gender disaggregated data on time in paid work, time in unpaid work, and time in personal and relational time. Okay, so just this threefold division by gender. And remember, if we say that it's part of the UN statistical system, then the UN has to actually enable countries to collect this data. It's a big thing, okay? So, and once you have that, then you can actually get after your governments. You can say, why is the unpaid labor part going up so much? Or, you can do all kinds of things. You can use it to mobilize. Okay? The third is data that's already being collected, okay? The proportion of the population that can afford the FAO's nutritious diet.
Poverty.
And that again is a horrifying thing, right? In India, for example, our income poverty, thanks to the government's redefinition of income poverty, is down to some ridiculous 14% or something. The proportion of the population that cannot afford a nutritious diet is 74%. So you see that these things can matter. And by the way, the nutritious diet is regionally defined. So it's one group for South Asia and so on and so forth. Of course, by the way, there's politics and everything, including data collection. So I have to warn you that this is the data for 2023. The Indian government, of course, doesn't like data that doesn't make it look good. So it has gone after the FAO, and the FAO has now revised its definition, I'm told. So for next year, expect a dramatic decline in this number. From 74, it'll go down to less than half, maybe 1/3, maybe 10% almost. But I'm just saying, we should actually be pushing at an indicator like this, okay? Another indicator that is kind of obvious, it's the carbon emissions data. But here again, we are suggesting it is carbon emissions multiplied by the domestic carbon inequality. That is to say, the carbon emissions of the top 10% and the bottom 50%. Because we know that most of the carbon emissions come from the top 10%, globally and within countries, okay? And so if you track that, you actually get a sense of what's going on in terms of the aggregate. There is also per capita grain consumption, which has been proposed. I didn't propose it, somebody else in the board proposed it, on the grounds that per capita grain consumption is, after a certain level of income, a bad thing. Because the more grain you're consuming, it's livestock.
Grain.
Yeah.
Grain, yeah, food grain, yeah. And so that's the fifth indicator that's been proposed. The idea for doing all this is that if you have these indicators tracked regularly, you can use them. And maybe over time, our own people will start saying, well, forget the GDP, what's happened to the labor market indicator? Even as a political tool. So we have to begin by doing this. Instead of simply saying get rid of GDP, nobody's going to listen to us. Let's focus on making these other indicators powerful. Now, this matters a lot because obviously the UN has to accept it. And to my deep sadness, there has really been very little mobilization about this. And so I suspect that the UN is not, the General Assembly is not going to pass it. I mean, the ECOSOC, I think, passed it, but you know, the General Assembly, it's happening right next week, right, or 2 weeks from now. I suspect it's not going to be passed. Maybe it won't even be tabled because some usual suspects have already indicated their displeasure. And these are not just the rich countries. It's Saudi Arabia, it's India, it's other similar countries, shall I say, that have expressed unhappiness with having to do all of these indicators and saying it adds to the burden and so on and so forth of the countries. So this is something we should be mobilizing around. This is something we should be pushing. Of course, it's not an ultimate solution. Of course, it's not revolution. Of course, it's not a transformation, but it's something that will enable us to lobby and mobilize around these issues. So let's actually join forces in things where we can make even a small difference if it enables further down the road policy changes. So that's the second thing. And the third thing finally, and I think it was already kind of touched on, is about alliances, because it's not going to work without alliances. My colleague at UMass Amherst, Nancy Folbray, whom all of you know, and Nancy had this wonderful phrase, necessity is the mother of coalitions. Yeah. And boy, is it a mother. But the thing is, we are still not generating enough coalitions. And I believe that there's a little bit more, but it's certainly not enough. And we have to be much more actively engaged in joining forces. So, for example, I don't know how many of you even knew that this whole thing was happening in the UN, right? Because, so that's the problem. And I have now discovered, working with many UN agencies, that it's not just that one UN agency has no idea what the other UN agency is doing. It's also that within a UN agency, this department has no idea what that division is. And it's also jealously guarded because you have to preserve your turf. And I mean, okay, this is part of a broader issue, so, but nonetheless, as a result, we don't have coalitions. We don't have the kinds of coalitions we need. And I'm just going to list a number of the coalitions that I think we could be very productively engaged in. And I'm saying some of us are individually, but maybe as broad movements, we should be thinking of Venn diagrams of the overlap and just actively engage in these coalitions. The tax justice network. There was a lovely discussion on tax earlier. The debt justice network. I mean, I don't have to tell you what that means in terms of the gender implications. All the UN agencies, ILO, UNDP, UN Women, UNRISD, okay, or etc. The UN High Commission for Human Rights. You know, I don't know if you know, but he has been, he's been actively working for what he calls the human rights economy. And that is really an economy that places human rights as the goal. And then says, what are the different types of economic organization and strategy that are required to ensure human rights? Now, the overlap with our feminist struggles is so obvious, right? But we should actually be working with them and doing joint programs and going out there and talking about it and pushing it at every level in every forum and so on. The WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, I was a member of that, but you know, the reason I also want to raise it is because it touches on the final point I was going to make, so I'll come back to that. Marcella's group and the manifesto that they produced, yeah, which pretty much says everything we want to say also. But why are we working with them also, you know? And we shouldn't be saying, well, it also has so-and-so person whom I disagree with on some other issue. No, we have to do it. We have to align on specific issues, on specific policies and so on, to push particular agendas. The democratizing work group, you know, I mean, so much excellent work was done, which has huge gender implications. Let's put that also very much as part of our broader group. I mean, this is just a off-the-cuff kind of thing, but there are so many that we could actually think of aligning with and working with as coalitions. Finally, and I think I come back to this whole GDP versus other kinds of issues. In the WHO Council, we also had a kind of manifesto to begin with, and that manifesto. So this was a very interesting council. Mariana Mazzucato was the head of it, the chairperson, and it was all women. Okay, and not because it was they were immediately asked, right? Why is it all women? And her answer was, I mean, they were just the best. It wasn't because we were only choosing women, these were just the best ones I could think of. But the manifesto basically said that what we are looking for is an economy that works for the health for all. We are not saying that, oh, if you make people more healthy, it contributes this much more GDP. Just like, you know, the typical OECD gender thing, if you put more women into work, it will add 26% to GDP by 2050, you know. No, we're not interested in that. We are interested in an economy that delivers health for all. We are interested in an economy that delivers inclusive social justice, let's say, or capabilities for all, or whatever. But the point is, the economy is there to serve society, people, and planet. Whereas we have gone the other way. We are worshipping at the altar of the economy, and we're constantly told that all the other stuff has to go because it will have all of these economic impacts. We have to overturn that. And until we overturn that, we can't really achieve the other stuff. So in a way, we have to work with everybody in their own ways who is trying to achieve that, whether or not they're explicitly aware of the gender implications of it. I mean, we can teach them as we go along, but the point is we have to be engaged with all of these other groups because it's a big fight out there and we know that. And also because, let's face it, we should have been much more successful because we've got the logic, we've got the solutions, we've got everything that matters intellectually. Now the issue is, how do we get it in terms of political and policy power? Okay, so let me stop here. I'm sure I would much rather hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
We can take a few questions or comments. So,
Oh, am I too late already?
it's fine.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
I thought I was.
I'm sure that people have questions and comments. So just to start things off, I'll make a couple of remarks, reactions to what Jayati said. Very interesting, very inspiring, of course. But I was just thinking that, you know, a couple of things could for example, valuing unpaid care work, right? As you probably know, the US now publishes annual data on the value of household production. And that has become really the driving force behind why they do timely surveys every year. Because they have to create that satellite account, and that's authorized by the United States Congress. So sometimes, these goals, one of the goals that you indicators that you proposed was this annual indicator of unpaid and paid, right? So they can play into one another. The other thing is about time poverty and how it impacts income poverty. That I think the quality issue that how it affects the kind of housework or the kind of household production that you indicated is very important. But it also has, as Claire Vickery pointed out, a direct impact on income poverty itself.
That's my point.
And and that's what we have tried to capture in the limit. So that's the work that we've been doing. Anyway, that's it for me. And now let's take questions.
There's a hand up.
Starting from, Marley. Can you please be brief in your questions?
I'm so sorry, that's my fault.
Given that we already have taken some time. Gone over. Marley, you want to go first? Then Luis.
Oh, thank you.
And there on that side.
Thank you for a great presentation. You ended with developing the political and policy power. And earlier you talked about you have to make enough noise. And of course, one of the missing ingredients has been organizing. I mean, that brings real change, and there's been a lack of that. There's been first and second wave feminism, but there hasn't been a third wave. But that could do a lot. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I don't have any question. Yeah. Later.
Luisa. Yeah.
I'll go first.
Okay. Thank you so much. So what was I thinking? I'm sorry. I got sidetracked with you wanting to go.
You wanna go first?
Okay, and just one, I would, thank you very much, that was very inspiring, but in the list of things in which we were sidetracked or fell into traps, I think the supply side approach is one to take. Because it is, I mean, it's the more immediate, I see at least that when well-meant colleagues, economists want to work about women, they see the supply side as the immediate. Oh, it's the skills. Oh, it's opportunities. So our thinking is kind of requires a little more of sophistication, has not immediate but mediated impacts. So it is more complex. So I think part of it. So to me, one of the remedies is to avoid. You mentioned it, but I would like to re-emphasize it. Avoid silo approaches and go for integrated approaches. Okay, yes, supply side interventions are important and are not enough, but we know that if we don't think about opportunities, then they won't come out of the blue, and that kind of thinking. You mentioned it, but I wanted to emphasize it. Thank you.
Okay, I got it. So one thing is on this GDP issue in general, and I think there are moments where there is a strategic use for using the tools that are there that we want to overcome, but that should not mean that we're not on the other side working on, overthrowing them. So I don't know, the whole strategic way that IPAC has been using this and investing in care and so on. I don't think we shouldn't use this, but I always feel a little also, so where do I stop that? And where do I start really making the point that this is not about increasing GDP, this is about centering women's lives here. So I think we need to be working on two sides, to do incremental work on one side, using the strategics that we need, but also keeping in mind that this means that we need to do another work. The other thing I would like to say is like how I've been thinking about this in terms of actually actually engaging people in general. And there are like three groups that I feel that we've been trying to engage. The first one is how to engage feminists in economic talk in general. And this is something that we've been doing a lot of work in the case of Latin America, specifically with feminist tax policies. So we've been doing a lot of meetings and trying to think, how do we actually bring those very technical terms to the claims of feminists in general? So this is one. I don't have an answer, but I think this is important. The second is, how do we engage the global north in the global south policy agenda? And I'm going to give an example. Like at the IAFI, for example, been doing this huge effort of having translation. We put up these amazing sessions, and every time the Latin American sessions are being done for the Latin Americans. No one is coming to see them. So I don't know how do we actually engage them. We have the translation, we have everything. People say, oh, they're doing such great work in Latin America, but there is no actual exchange. So I don't know how to do that. The third one is we're not even heard by our peers. And when I say we're not even heard by our peers, it's not that we're not heard by other economists. We're not even that heard by heterodox economists that much. So I think even mainstream has done better with that. Mainstream has been talking about gender more than heterodox economics in general. So they are delivering the wrong answers to the problems we have. And we are not even able to really push within the heterodox so that we actually have that seal of this is an economist that I trust. So I would think that those are three strategies that we need to also think about. Thank you.
So the back, Jill.
She had a question too.
Yeah.
I had a question before, but then,
Just you.
I was just recognizing her that she had a question. And Marcella also there, so that's,
three and then.
yeah, that's it, yeah, three more.
Continuing from the Latin American case, actually coming from Turkey, Jayati, thank you so much. It's like, voicing what we are dealing with right now. You know about the academic situation, universities situation in Turkey. Now, how I realize how the alliance is so critical, especially on our issues, alliances between, academia and women's associations. So what we have been dealing, we've been active with IPEC and many others in Turkey actually, trying to, how can I say, organize all the, together with the association's representatives, fighting for some of the things that you mentioned, for the indicators, statistics, what do we miss, what they are hiding. And then they find a way to work with other data sets, and then they make them official. And then we, again, following them, what we call gender equality monitoring association. And women's associations are also, there's a big group with more than 300 of them come under Eşit platform. So we also work with them. It's a whole lot of different world, which is very important, fighting for the human rights and rights-based gender equality policies. Just wanted to ask, that was very effective. That's how we understood from the newspapers' titles, actually. Every weekend then, they just, target the conservative, especially newspapers, showing, these are the people who are doing, fighting with the government policy and so on and so on. But just wanted to mention that alliances should be also, we need to take responsibility as academics, that I just wanted to.
And the last point is a bit subtle.
Yeah, with the organizing with the rights associations.
Yeah. Okay.
Fighting for human rights and.
Got it. Marcella, right?
May I?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you also for mentioning our manifesto, of course. I believe so much in the need for alliances that we published it in the newsletter of the Union for Radical Political Economy. And now, thanks to Jeffrey Sachs, we have a shorter version that will be discussed in the Vatican for the economic conference for the Jubilee in November. So you can imagine how broad is our need for alliances. Anyway, but let's go back to the institution that you mentioned. Why don't we think about doing something at the CSW in March 2025? We are celebrating, celebrating in inverted column, 30 years of the Beijing conference. 30 years. And the big failure is there. Arabia Saudi actually ruling the game. So why don't we think about doing something there? I'm ready to come if you want.
I think there's some online questions.
Oh, sorry, but after.
Okay, but maybe her as well. Sorry, I'll be very fast in my answers, but they should get.
Yeah.
Hi,
Yes.
there's one that's last.
Hi, I have two questions. I'll be very brief. You mentioned about the data scenario, the indicator scenario of India. And recently there have been all over news like last year about the downgrading quality of data in Indian context. So what would be your advice to students who are trying to work on Indian economy, like how they should approach the various data sets and like come up with work? And my second question is, I have also been thinking in this line, like there has been so many great works on identifying the key problems, the sustainability or like the inclusivity things. But there are really a problem in terms, like lack of literature in terms of finding the solutions. And what is your take on like what are the areas the young scholars should need to focus on or like looking into the betterment of the world?
Okay.
Hi, I'll just very quickly, I wanted to actually ask a couple questions.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh, sorry, Ruth Badru. I am Nigerian and I'm asking this question from that perspective. So more often than not, as a Nigerian, you do get a lot of economic theories that are told to you about how the economy should work. And we talk about social norms a lot, institutional frameworks a lot, but at times it's almost like a top-down approach, and I think you touched on that a little bit. And I do wonder if maybe the thing that we're missing as academics is thinking about, especially from macroeconomic analysis, thinking about grassroots macroeconomics. Because I mean, there's a lot of things, we've identified some key issues today, and I think even in the panel session, there were loads of issues that were raised that were priorities, but are those actually priorities for people on ground? So we're not representative of the general population in the world or in the spaces that we occupy. How do we make sure that we're not, I almost feel like at times academia ends up being this very top-down approach. There's no participation in terms of how we do research, how we implement those policies, or even how we advise policymakers. How do we make that shift? How do we bridge that gap so that we're not telling people what we think is best for them, but getting them to be co-participants and co-producers of solutions in their communities or environments?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So this is Hossein. I'm just echoing what
I'm
Louisa
sorry, I didn't
said.
get your name.
Hossein. I'm just echoing what Louisa said. I think putting a lot of criticism on GDP from the perspective of political economy, that I'm not sure will work, because I have seen in many events that political economists make a lot of critics on those measurements. Well, I would say traditional measurement that economists use, but they don't provide their own measurements. So a lot of critics, but not anything new. So it's mainly they say, okay, these are the qualitative things, governance stuff, but when it comes to measuring something, they don't provide something concretely.
I thought I just did. Were you not listening? There were 5 indicators.
No. I agree with you, but I mean,
Yeah.
that GDP, I agree with Louisa, works well. But I mean, in that, to some extent, okay, you should step it forward. But what you did, I mean, you can hardly see in different events. I mean, to make a kind of replacement, saying, okay, that this doesn't work?
No, so the idea is to add, not to replace,
I-
right? Yeah.
I'm not difficult with the words. I agree with you, okay, to extend it or to make it a little bit more workable. But because most of the measurements that political economists introduce are qualitative, it's hard to measure. And then they come with the, I mean, with the measurements that doesn't work with the economists.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there were some online questions, right?
There were a couple, yes. In the context of unpaid labor, what are your insights into socializing care? By which I mean the state taking up activities of care through, for example, community kitchens. Would that be a more organic way of valuing care? Another question, should we also abandon the HDR and the various gender-related indices that make use of GDP?
Okay, wow, lots of questions. Let me just begin with the GDP thing. So, yes, I agree, Louisa, I agree that GDP has a role, and let's face it, it also matters in a whole range of other things, and it's an underlying kind of notion of levels of per capita income that determine something, not always, if it's very unequally distributed, not always the bulk of the population, but nonetheless it's important. Which is why the idea is not to replace. I said it, but maybe I should have said it 10 times because I don't think everybody got it. It's not to replace, it's to add. And the purpose of adding is to actually provide instruments that can be lobbied around. So, for example, if you do have a labor market indicator, that provides you an instrument to say, well, look, maybe you're saying per capita income is going, and maybe it is, but on the other hand, actually most workers are not better off even in money income terms. So it's a different thing that you can lobby around. Food access, again, in other words, all of these are things that you can mobilize around, and they're all measurable. And some of them, in fact, are currently measured. So it's not impossible to measure any of these, I would say. Does it mean that we abandon anything else? No, I'm not talking about abandoning anything else, but I'm saying if you regularly monitor these, it adds to your ability to push for a broader perspective on what an economy should be delivering. I think that's really the brunt of that particular argument. The issue about organizing, absolutely. Yeah, definitely organizing is essential. And we don't do enough of it for sure, but then, I think there has to be much more, let us say, meeting of organizers and academics, rather than us saying we will also go out and organize, because we may not also be that good at it. I can tell you in India, I'm really bad. I'm really bad. They see me and they say, oh, it's another elite woman from, wherever it is. And I do not, whereas when I meet with trade union leaders and with women who are activists locally, I can talk to them and explain, and then they will go out and organize. So I think, yes, that's absolutely essential. Oh, Louisa, this is such tough questions. How do we engage feminists in the economy? That's easier. I find most feminists actually quite willing to listen to, and because mostly they get scared off, right? They talk, oh, it's too technical, you won't understand it, it's all very complex, and you're just this person who doesn't understand. But when you explain it and you can train people to call the bluff, I think it works. So I think that part is easier. How do we exchange among ourselves? Oh boy. I think the answer to that one, and it's also the answer to somebody else who was talking about it, is just to keep at it. It's the same thing you're saying, persistent. Just keep making noise, and at some point, subliminally, maybe some of it gets absorbed, or you get heard because you just say, okay, let's just listen just to get her out of the room, whatever it is, I think we have to be really just persistent in this. Valerie, I couldn't agree more. Completely. And yes, when you were talking, I was thinking back on a recent conversation I had exactly on this whole issue about skills. And it's amazing how people still think skill training is the solution to everything. It's because it's easy, right? You can say, oh, we set up this training facility. Oh, we have this program. Then you can claim you've trained 27 people, and then if they haven't got jobs, well, that's it. So I completely agree with you there. And that was fascinating about Turkey. Yeah. So obviously you people are already out there doing the question about how do students in India work on Indian data? I think there you are. Yeah. So you really do have to be careful. There's no doubt. There are some data sets that are still okay, where they still haven't changed it dramatically, like the labor force surveys. They will. There's no question. They will, because they've realized that that's also an Achilles heel. There are others, but they are changing all the time and they are messing up big time. So it is a difficult one. I don't disagree with you. Fortunately, there are now some alternatives. I mean, Indra was telling me there is a whole new program to do time use surveys with a group, including former statisticians and official statisticians and others. So yes, then we can use that. Basically, we have to just try and explore whatever options are available. Ruth, are we representative of people on the ground? No, but we have to be listening, right? And the purpose of, I don't think we can pretend to be people on the ground, but we have to constantly be in interaction with. That's the point.
That we don't do that. We don't.
Well, okay, I think, let me put it this way, we should be doing a lot more. Yeah. I don't think none of us does. I mean, I don't think it's true that nobody does it. I think I can see people in this room whom I know do it. So, but you're right, that the dominant thing is not. And we should be doing a lot more. There I completely agree. But also I think listening is a critical part of it all through. And one of the things in India, for example, which is, just to give you an example, in India, the right-wing women's movement is very strong. Okay, and it's because the right-wing ecosystem has been out there for half a century working on them. And so then when even our more progressive or left-wing activists go, they are really not taken seriously because those people have embedded themselves in society. They go to the temples with them, they go to the weddings and the other rituals and etc. And so they are embedded in society in a way where the left-wing ones are seen as not necessarily part of it because they don't go to temples, for example. So, you're already kind of seen as a little weird because you're not doing the rituals and so on. So there are constantly these dilemmas, these difficulties, that's part of the whole issue of, how you mobilize and how you integrate. But the critical point is that we should be listening to both. We should be listening to those right-wing women activists and identifying what their issues are. And thinking about those just as much as we think, listen to the people who are on our side, if you like. So I think listening is a critical part. I mean, I don't think I should pretend that I'm this big grassroots activist. There's no way, right? But on the other hand, I will listen to as many of them as I can. That's important, I think. Also, I already answered that. And finally, and socializing, care, and communications. Yeah, sure, they're also good. One of the solutions. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution for any country or region or even locality. Yeah, so we have to be thinking of new, different solutions for the context, which come from the ground up, which come from what people need at that time, and we have to think of it that way. But yeah, finally, I want to end. But semi-finally, with Melania's point that you have to go with the integrated approaches. Even those local solutions cannot be just one intervention in one thing. They have to be thinking through that particular system. Yes, Marcella, let's do it.